Hello everyone, I need to show you something, because I don't think people outside of Russia actually understand how bad this has gotten for Putin right now. We're not talking about some abstract battlefield update. We're talking about Moscow's own stock market falling for 18 straight weeks in a row, the longest losing streak Russia has seen since 1997. We're talking about Russian billionaires, guys who are personally close to Putin, quietly moving billions of dollars out of the country because they're scared their own government is going to take it from them. And we're talking about drones hitting apartment buildings in towns just outside Moscow, close enough that residents are now living the war that Putin always promised would stay far away from them. So, in this video, I want to walk you through exactly what's happening right now. The strikes hitting deep inside Russia, the economic collapse that's quietly getting worse every single week, the oligarchs pulling their money out, and a former Russian prime minister, a guy who actually worked side by side with Putin, coming out and saying on camera that Putin is facing what he calls big problems. Let's start with the drones, because this is where everything else connects back to. Over the last couple of weeks, Ukraine has been sending waves of long-range drones deep into Russian territory, and they're not just hitting empty fields near the border anymore. On July 18th, Ukrainian drones destroyed two massive warehouses belonging to Wildberries, which is basically Russia's version of Amazon. One of those warehouses was in the Tambov region, hundreds of miles from the front line. The other was in Elektrostal, just outside Moscow. Then, just one day later, Ukraine hit another Wildberries facility in a different part of the Moscow region. Now here's why that matters so much. Wildberries isn't just some online store where Russians order shoes and phone cases. Reports, and even pro-Russian military bloggers, have confirmed that a huge amount of dual-use gear gets sold and shipped through that platform. Things like drone components, combat equipment, and military supplies that volunteers buy and send straight to Russian soldiers on the front line. So when Ukraine says these warehouses were legitimate military targets, there's actually a real case behind that claim, and it's genuinely controversial inside Russia right now. Because Russia has used that exact same justification for years to explain its own strikes on Ukrainian logistics companies. But the economic damage from this goes way beyond a moral debate. Wildberries and its biggest competitor together control about 77% of Russia's entire e-commerce market. That single Elektrostal warehouse alone accounted for a huge chunk of the company's total storage space. Analysts estimate the combined strikes may have destroyed somewhere between 150 and 350,000 square meters of logistics space. And remember, this company had a similar warehouse burn down back in 2024, and it took a year and a half just to rebuild that one facility. Multiply that damage now, spread across several locations at once, and you start to understand why regular Russian small business owners, people who had absolutely nothing to do with this war, are now posting online about losing their entire life savings and being told by Wildberries that drone strikes simply aren't covered. And it's not just warehouses hundreds of miles away. On July 13th, a Ukrainian drone attack damaged an apartment building in Solnekhnogorsk, a town in the Moscow region, close enough to the capital that it's basically a suburb. Just days later, Moscow's own mayor confirmed that dozens of Ukrainian drones were targeting the city directly, and Ukraine's president openly said to expect more of these strikes going forward. This is exactly the kind of thing Putin spent years trying to prevent regular Russians from ever having to think about. The idea that this war was happening somewhere else, to someone else, far away from Moscow's comfortable apartment blocks. Now let's talk about the money, because honestly, this might be the part that worries the Kremlin the most. Russia's stock market, tracked by something called the MOEX index, has now fallen for 18 consecutive weeks. That is the longest unbroken losing streak Russia has recorded since 1997. Since the start of this year alone, the index has dropped by roughly 30%, and it's now sitting at its lowest level since October of 2022, right around where it was during some of the worst moments right after the full-scale invasion began. Basically, nearly 4.5 years of market gains have been completely wiped out. And it's not just stocks. Gazprom, Russia's massive state energy company, just saw its shares sink to a record low. Corporate profits in Russia dropped 26% in a single quarter. Capital investment fell over 14%, the worst decline in 16 years. More than half of surveyed Russian businesses have had to pause their long-term development plans entirely. This isn't one bad news cycle. This is a slow, grinding economic decline that just keeps compounding week after week. So naturally, if you're one of Russia's richest people, what do you do when you're watching all of this happen in real time? According to Bloomberg, several of Russia's wealthiest businessmen, some of them personally close to Putin, have been moving billions of dollars out of the country over the past year, and that trend has sped up noticeably in recent months. Their money is shifting into cryptocurrency, gold, foreign real estate, and private investment funds, especially in Gulf countries like the UAE. Some are moving funds into Cyprus, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Others are quietly investing in projects across Africa. Why the sudden rush? Because since 2024, Russian authorities have been aggressively seizing assets from wealthy business people, especially anyone who kept ties to the outside world. Even something as simple as holding a second passport. Russia's own prosecutor general's office confirmed it transferred assets worth more than 4 trillion rubles. That's over $50 billion to the state in just the past year alone. So if you're a Russian billionaire watching your friends and colleagues lose their companies to the state, while the economy keeps sinking and the war keeps draining the national budget, moving your money somewhere safer isn't paranoia. It's just basic self-preservation. And here's a small detail that says a lot. Back in March, Putin reportedly held a closed-door meeting with major Russian business leaders, and one of them, billionaire Suleiman Karimov, actually proposed that big businesses should make a large financial contribution directly to the state. Putin reportedly went along with the idea. Think about what that tells you. The government is running low enough on money that it's now leaning on its own billionaires to help personally fund the war effort. So, put all of that together. A stock market in freefall, businesses pausing investment, billionaires quietly moving money out of the country, and drones now reaching close enough to Moscow to damage apartment buildings and destroy warehouses that keep the economy running. This brings us to Mikhail Kasyanov, and honestly, his perspective here is genuinely worth paying attention to. Kasyanov served as Russia's prime minister under Putin from 2000 to 2004, back in Putin's very first term. So this is someone who worked closely with Putin, who understood how he operated from the inside long before any of this war ever began. Kasyanov later broke away, became an opposition figure, and has lived in exile for years. Today, Russia has officially labeled him an extremist and a terrorist. In a recent interview, Kasyanov described the mood inside Russia right now in blunt terms. He said fear has spread through the country, and that even people close to the top, government ministers included, are quietly living in fear themselves. He explained that many of them privately want the war to end, but feel trapped. Almost like hostages to the system they serve, because stepping out of line could cost them everything. Kasyanov also made a really interesting observation about why Putin hasn't ordered a full, nationwide military mobilization, despite years of heavy battlefield losses. His theory is that Putin is deliberately avoiding that step because he's worried about upsetting Russia's urban middle class, the people living comfortably in cities like Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Yekaterinburg, who have mostly been able to live as if the war wasn't really happening around them. Kasyanov put it simply, Putin is very concerned about that risk. But Kasyanov pointed out that this comfortable bubble is exactly what's starting to crack. He said that, up until recently, life in those major Russian cities could continue almost normally, untouched by the war. But he explained that starting this spring, and especially now, Ukraine's growing advantage in long-range missiles and drones has fundamentally changed that. The strikes are reaching further, hitting harder, and landing closer to the places Putin always assumed were safe. Now, I want to be upfront about something. Some corners of the internet have run wild with claims that Putin is personally pushing for surrender or that Russia is on the verge of total collapse any day now. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that's confirmed, because it isn't. Anyone telling you they know exactly when or how this ends is guessing. And you should be skeptical of any channel that claims otherwise, no matter how confident they sound or how dramatic their thumbnail looks. This war has surprised almost everyone who's tried to predict it so far, and there's no reason to think that changes now. What is confirmed from actual financial data, actual reporting, and actual on-record interviews is that the pressure on Putin right now is real, it's building from multiple directions at once. And it's coming from places that are much harder for the Kremlin to control with propaganda alone. You can control a television broadcast. You can tell state media to talk about something else. Run a different headline. Cut away from the damage. Put on a parade instead. Remind everyone about some old military victory from decades ago. That playbook has worked for Putin for a long time. It's a lot harder to control a stock market that's fallen for 18 straight weeks, or a billionaire quietly wiring his fortune to Dubai, or an apartment building in a Moscow suburb with a hole in its roof. None of those things care what the evening news decides to report. A stock chart doesn't listen to state propaganda. A wire transfer doesn't wait for permission from a press conference. And a hole in a roof is a hole in a roof, no matter what anyone on television says about it. Think about it from the perspective of an ordinary person living in Moscow right now. For years, the war was something that happened on television, in a place far away, to people they didn't know personally. You could scroll past it. You could go to work, get lunch, pick up your kids, live your life, and the war was just something happening off-screen, in someone else's country, to someone else's family. Now their own mayor is publicly counting how many drones got shot down over their city last night. Out loud, on social media, for everyone to see, sometimes multiple updates in a single evening. Their own stock portfolio, if they have one, has been bleeding value for 4.5 months straight, with no clear bottom in sight, and no guarantee it stops falling anytime soon. And if they work for one of the businesses that just paused its investment plans, or one of the countless small sellers who lost everything when those Wildberries warehouses burned, the war isn't background noise anymore. It's sitting right in their living room, in their bank statement, in their job security, in the conversation they have with their spouse at the kitchen table about whether they can afford next month's rent. And here's the thing about pressure like this. It doesn't need one single dramatic moment to matter. It doesn't need Putin standing at a podium announcing defeat, or a headline that says the war is over, or some clean, obvious turning point that historians can point back to later. It just needs to keep quietly stacking up, week after week, seizure after seizure, warehouse after warehouse, drone after drone, stock market decline after stock market decline, until enough people around him start acting like something is coming, even if nobody ever says it out loud in public. That's usually how these things actually work in the real world, and it's rarely how the movies show it. Not one big collapse, not one dramatic surrender speech, but a slow accumulation of small cracks, spreading quietly through an economy and a society, until eventually those cracks add up to something nobody can ignore anymore, no matter how good their propaganda machine is. So where does that leave things right now? Ukraine keeps pushing its drone campaign deeper and deeper into Russian territory, hitting the exact kind of economic and logistics targets that keep the war funded and supplied. Not just tanks and trenches out on some distant front line, but warehouses, oil depots, ports, and the supply chains that quietly keep the whole machine running day to day, far from the cameras and far from the headlines most people actually see. Russia's economy keeps sliding further into trouble, with a stock market that can't seem to find a bottom no matter how many weeks go by, corporate profits that keep shrinking quarter after quarter, capital investment falling at its worst rate in over a decade, and businesses that are increasingly scared to invest in their own country's future, because nobody can predict what gets hit next. or seized next, or taxed next, or quietly reassigned to someone with better connections to the Kremlin. And the people at the very top, the ones with enough money and connections to see the writing on the wall clearly before anyone else does, are already quietly moving their wealth somewhere safer, just in case. Not because state television told them to worry, because their own bank accounts, their own business partners, and their own private conversations behind closed doors are telling them something state television never will. These are people who built entire fortunes navigating Russian politics successfully for decades. They didn't get that rich, or stay that rich for this long, by ignoring warning signs. If they're moving billions out right now, quietly, without any public announcement, that alone tells you something that no press conference ever could. None of this guarantees how this war ends, or when. Wars have dragged on for years, past the point where economies looked broken and leaders looked cornered. And predicting a collapse on a timeline is always a losing bet, no matter how confident someone sounds doing it, and no matter how many boxes they check off on a list. Countries have absorbed far worse economic pain than this, and kept fighting regardless. So, I'm not telling you this ends next month, or even next year, but it does tell you something important about where things stand today, right now, in this moment. The story Putin has been selling to his own people for years, that this war stays far away and doesn't touch ordinary Russian life, is getting harder and harder to believe every single week. It's harder to believe when your neighbor's apartment building gets hit. It's harder to believe when your investments keep losing value, no matter how long you hold on and hope things turn around. It's harder to believe when your local business owner friend closes his shop because a warehouse fire wiped out everything he'd built. And it's harder to believe when the wealthiest, best-connected people in the entire country, the ones who usually know first, the ones with access every ordinary citizen doesn't have, are quietly packing their money up and moving it somewhere else, just in case. And when the people closest to Putin, the billionaires, the former officials who once sat in his own cabinet, even his own country's market economy, start behaving like something serious is coming, that's usually a signal worth paying attention to. Whether or not anyone inside the Kremlin ever admits it out loud, and whether or not it ever makes it onto Russian state television at all. If this video helped you understand what's actually happening behind the headlines, hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think happens next inside Russia. I'll see you in the next one.